أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We start by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thanking Him for His immense bounties upon us, the blessing of health, the blessing of mind, the ability to gather here on this day, on this night, for His sake and His sake alone. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept the time that we sacrifice for His sake, to reward us for it, to allow us inshallah Rabbaneen to make use of the few minutes that we spend for His sake inshallah Rabbaneen, that the angels mention our names with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen. Jazakumullah khair Nabil for the introduction. So don't worry about the slides, I'll take care of it inshallah. The story of Al-Andalus is a beautiful story inshallah, and it is one that we can deduce many lessons, many lessons from. And so, just to let you know, my primary sources are Dr. Raghib Al-Sarjani's book and series, and Dr. Tariq Soidan's book and series. But there are many other sources inshallah as well, which we can post online as well inshallah for your reference. So what are we going to be talking about today? Inshallah, today is the first session, and so it is a prelude to the road to Al-Andalus. We'll be talking about what happened during the few years before Al-Andalus. What happened? What was going on? So, we have an introduction. We'll answer a few questions. The importance of history has already been touched upon by Sheikh Khalid, Jazakallah khair, but we'll touch upon it briefly again. As in, why talk about history to begin with? Why the history of Al-Andalus per se? Some other questions we'll try to address is, why did the Muslims carry their swords to Al-Andalus? And yes, they did carry their swords to Al-Andalus. Why do people need Islam to begin with? We'll talk about the Umayyad Caliphate, Khilafah al-Umayyah, inshallah. And then we'll go into the actual chapters of today's session, which will talk about Musa ibn Nusayr, about his father Nusayr, Musa ibn Nusayr himself, West Africa. We'll talk about Tariq ibn Ziyad. We'll talk about the sea, and what the Muslims did in the sea. And then we'll talk about Al-Andalus, inshallah, Rabbil Alameen, and conclude with the procession of light. What is the procession of light? Who are they? Bismillah. The importance of history. Why talk about history to begin with? Is a very important question. It's one that we need to answer, inshallah, and know clearly and wholeheartedly, inshallah, accept. We're not trying to cry over spilt milk. So this is something that we need to, inshallah, convey and need to understand. We're not here to relive the glories of the past, to, perhaps drug ourselves with this feeling of nostalgia. That's not the purpose of this series and these sessions. 1/3 of the Quran is stories, as the Shaykh mentioned. And this verse was also mentioned by the Shaykh. So relate the story perchance that they may reflect. And so this is the guideline. The Quran is a tarbiyah curriculum. It is a guide. It is a curriculum for us to develop ourselves, to improve ourselves, to develop us as individuals and as nations. Tafakkur is the guideline. Tafakkur is the purpose. We're not saying stories for storytelling or for amusement. We're not here to enjoy ourselves, even though we will enjoy ourselves, inshallah. We're not here to have fun, although inshallah we will have fun. The purpose really is tafakkur, is to reflect, is to contemplate, is to understand. Many meanings of the word are reflected, focused, thought of, studied its meanings and implications. This is inshallah what we'll be doing with the story of Al-Andalus. We're going to be analyzing history, a true analysis, clarifying our true history, removing any fabrications. And yes, there are many fabrications. فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. This is a verse from the Quran that highlights that there is no change that will happen without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, and no turning off from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's way. What does that mean? It means that there are rules of success and rules of failure, and history shows us this, and these rules are the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we reflect on these rules, we can study them, we can understand them, we can try to adopt them, inshallah Rabbani. The rules don't change. They're the same rules all throughout history. Before we go into why the history of Al-Andalus, who has actually heard of the phrase, history repeats itself? Show of hands. History repeats itself. We've all probably heard of the phrase. Can anyone actually be brave enough to tell me what does it mean? What does history repeats itself mean? Anyone? Just venture out, yes.
People make the same mistakes.
Jazakallah khair. So people make the same mistakes. The same mistakes. Jazakallah khair. Any other meaning that we can deduce from that phrase? History repeats itself. Yes? Say that again. The same problems come up. Jazakallah khair. Human nature is the same. Human nature is the same. If you put people in the same situation, in the same circumstances, it's bound to happen again, the same situation. Unless we reflect on the past to avoid those mistakes, just as Sheikh Khalid said, then we are not going to be benefiting from that past, from that history. We'll be redoing everything. And so really our purpose as Muslims is not to allow history to repeat itself, but benefit from history, inshaAllah Rabbil Alameen, so that we don't allow it to repeat itself, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, but inshaAllah repeat the same successes. Why the history of Al-Andalus per se? Years of Andalus are actually 805 years, from 92 to 897 Hijri. That's 800 years of our history as Muslims. Yet very few actually know about it. It's 2/3 of Islam's history. Many of us don't know much about it. Surprisingly so. Very few of the individuals actually know about the history of Al-Andalus. Very few. And in this history we see the coward trader. We see the brave mujahid. We see the honest. We see the brave, and we also see the treacherous. All kinds of people. We see them in governors, we see them in regular folk, and we see them in scholars. These are all examples of people that we should reflect upon and learn from. And they're there in the history of Al-Andalus. We also see the contribution of Islam to civilization. A contribution that is often neglected, often ignored, and often uncredited. Who here is actually, or knows about the Sultans of Science? Show of hands. Sultans of Science. Anybody know what this is? So the Sultans of Science, yes, can you tell us what it is? Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. And so it was an event at the Ontario Science Centre. It was a museum actually that showcased the Muslim contribution to science. And the whole museum, that whole section of the museum was called the Sultans of Science. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. Alhamdulillah, Arwa Makyus was blessed to have a trip that went there, and we saw it, and we had a full bus, alhamdulillah, and it was a beautiful day. Inshallah, if you actually Google it, or search it on YouTube, you'll find so many videos about it. A wonderful exhibition. Another one that's actually not so well known is 1001 Inventions. Who knows 1001 Inventions? Not 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights, no, not that. The 1001 Inventions. Does anyone know about it? Yes? Show of hands. Yes? Okay, can you tell us what it is about?
Isn't it some really Muslim contributions to science, technology, and English?
Jazakallahu khairan. It is a very beautiful initiative to showcase the neglected and often uncredited contribution of Muslims to civilization and modern civilization and science. Again, if you YouTube 1001 Inventions, you'll find lots of beautiful videos that showcase how Muslims have contributed to science. Often uncredited, often unheard of. Many non-Muslims don't know about it, and they're surprised when they hear about it. Surprised. Unfortunately, that's even the case among Muslims. They don't know about it. They're also surprised. Subhanallah. Some questions that we'll deal with, inshallah Rabbil Alameen, and there are many questions. The Battle of the Valley of Birbot. What is that about? Is it true that Tariq ibn Zayd actually burnt the ships? We saw in the video that statement that he made, right? When he told his troops that the enemy is in front of you and the sea is behind you. But legend says that he burnt the ships that they came on. Is that true? How and why? Where? If not, why is this story so famous? Who's actually heard that story, that Tariq ibn Zayd burnt the ships? Many of us have. Who is Abdurrahman al-Dakhil? Who is Abdurrahman al-Nasir? Who is Yusuf al-Tashfin? Who is Abu Bakr ibn Umar al-Natuni? Who are these people? Who is Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur? Who here knows Britney Spears? I say Britney Spears because in my generation, when I was younger, that's what was famous. Now there's probably many other people that I don't know. But they're all famous. But we don't know these people, subhanAllah. What is the region or the area of Al-Murabitin and Al-Muwahidin? What is this about? Some of us may have heard this. What about the Mosque of Cordoba? How did it transform into a church today? Yes, it's a church. Who heard of the castle of Al-Zahra and the castle of Al-Hamra? Who heard of the battle of Al-Aqab, where more than 80,000 Muslims died for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What caused the Muslims to lose Al-Andalus? What happened to the Muslims there? These are questions, inshallah, that will be answered throughout the series, not just today, inshallah. Some will be addressed today. Some questions that we'll talk about today, inshallah, are why did Muslims carry their swords to Al-Andalus? Why carry their swords to Al-Andalus? And yes, they did carry their swords to Al-Andalus. But why? And the answer is simple. If you look at it actually from our inter-country relationships today, it is considered to be an act of war. It's considered that Islam is spread by the sword, just like anti-Muslims would say. It's jihad, right? Holy war, as they like to say. But jihad actually has two types. One is known as jihad ad-daf', or of defense, which is understandable. You know, if you're in a country and an invading party comes, wreaking havoc and causing tribulations to the people that are living there, you have every right to defend yourself. Jihad ad-daf', defend yourself. It's understandable, everyone understands this. No one can dispute this. There's another kind called jihad at-talab, which is the jihad of request, or by request, and it's not so understandable. It is also known as jihad of spreading Islam. And it is actually da'wah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the task to spread this message to the whole world. It is our responsibility. When governments prevent da'wah, when they persecute the people, when they are not tolerant of different ideologies, when they cause havoc and injustices in the countries that they are ruling, isn't it fair to say that these governments don't deserve to remain? Isn't it fair to say that it is our duty, it is Islam's duty, to actually fight these governments? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Another question that poses itself is, what about Islam in the West? So many Muslims in the West, Western countries are non-Muslim. Are these governments supposed to be attacked by Islam? Are we supposed to declare jihad against the governments of the West? Valid question. And some would say that da'wah will not be allowed to flourish in the West. Some would actually say this. The da'wah will not flourish in the West. You can jump up and down and it will not happen, some people would say. And they would say, and it's a theory, and perhaps a tad bit conspiratorial, but we can't discount it completely. It's one that has some merit. Not full merit, but some merit. We cannot dismiss it completely. Why? Because they say, and this is very reasonable, for every picture of Islam shown in the media, you'll find 1,000 pictures attacking and discouraging Islam. And for every article written about Islam that's positive, you'll find 1,000 that are anti-Islamic. It's true. And you'll find that for every call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll find calls to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thousands of those. It's true. But the reality is, continuing on this question, that if you believe in the triumph of right, in truth and justice, despite all odds, if you believe in this, and if you look at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, if you look at history, you will find that truth and righteousness prevails in the end no matter what. Despite all odds. Despite that when you're writing one article about Islam, you'll find 1,000 attacking Islam, truth inshallah will prevail in the end, no matter what. And this is really an understanding that Mac fosters and believes in, that the way forward for the Muslim community must be through the education, improvement, and training of each individual, each family, and each Muslim community. And it's a long path. a very long and difficult path, and does not yield results as quick and as fast as we're perhaps hoping for. But it is one that will show, and it's a prerequisite for any righteous nation to rise. What's proof of this? Proof of this is when you look around in the Muslim community in Ottawa alone. Who here knows a convert? Just knows a convert. So many. There's so many, subhanAllah, despite all odds. They're proof that dawah is prevailing, that righteousness is prevailing, that you can perhaps look at things negatively, but it actually is true that the righteousness and truth will prevail and does prevail. Only with people that comprehend and understand. Another question is, why do people need Islam to begin with? I mean, why this fixation about Islam? Islam, 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 Islam. We have to spread Islam. We have to, any government that persecutes Islam, we have to try to oppose it and try to instill Islam in the hearts of people. Why? Why can't people just be Christians and Jews and non-Muslims? What's the big deal? And it's a very interesting question, and it really comes down to believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as opposed to disbelieving in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a very fine statement is given by Rabi'i ibn Amir. Rabi'i ibn Amir was sent, he was the ambassador of the Muslim army to the king of Persia. The Persian army commander met him. His name was Rustam Furukhzad. And this is what Rabi'i ibn Amir said to the king of Persia. This was a Bedouin man, perhaps uneducated, but he was a Muslim, a strong believer in Islam. And he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us to mankind to liberate them from the slavery of other men, to save them from it, and to give them the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of all men. Allah sent us to liberate them from the injustice of man-made religions to the justice of Islam. From the narrowness of this world to the spaciousness of this world and the hereafter. So no one answers this question better than Rabi'i ibn Amir does. Other questions is, why do people need Islam to begin with? Continuing with it is a very interesting verse which says, كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You were of the best nation produced for mankind. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is evil. This is our duty. This is something the Quran says, that we are the best nation for humanity. We're the best thing that happened to history. We're the best thing that happened to mankind. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it our responsibility so. It is our responsibility to ensure that the decision taken is an informed one. We don't want people to convert to Islam. We just want them to know about Islam. That's our duty. What happens next is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our responsibility is to convey the message as best as possible. What they do with it is their responsibility, their problem in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We just have to be the people to make sure that the decision that they take is an informed one. One not based on prejudice, not based on misinformation, not based on bias, not based on stereotypes, but based on facts and true information, what Islam is about. That's our responsibility. We must show that Islam is a way of life that's full of peace and mercy. And it's difficult. Definitely is difficult. Dr. Raghib al-Sajjani gives a very interesting analogy. He says it's like someone falling off a cliff, a very high cliff, kilometers high, and he's falling, and then someone in the middle grabs that person's arm and pulls him to safety. Imagine that grab. It must hurt. It must hurt. But what is the alternative? Just leave the person die? Let him fall? That's the analogy that Dr. Raghib gives. Other questions. Why Islam entered Al-Andalus? Why now? Not now, but why then? Why in the year 92 Hijri did Islam enter Andalus? Why then? And the answer is because Islam had reached the end of countries in West Africa. It reached the Atlantic Ocean. It was time for it to grow and spread even more. So next in line was Al-Andalus. But that's a simplistic answer. The other answer is about Constantinople. Does anyone know where Constantinople is? Yes? Turkey. Jazakallah khair. So we'll touch upon this later inshallah. What about Constantinople? What is this city got to do with Al-Andalus? And after that was France. After the Andalus was France. And Dr. Raghib says, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had willed it, Islam would have entered all of Europe. We'll see why didn't it? What happened to the Muslims? Why did Islam not enter the rest of Europe? The Umayyad Khilafah al-Amawiyya. Yes. Yes.
Also, Islam, when he entered these countries, because people of these countries were asking Muslims to come to defend of them against injustice.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. So Sheikh Khalid corrected me, and it's actually something we'll touch upon later on. It's not just about that. That's why I said it's a simplistic answer. The deeper answer, inshallah, will come to us. The people themselves living in these countries requested and needed Islam to come. And we'll see how. And it may seem flowery and rosy to us. I say, oh, no, that's not true. Islam came and was spread by the sword. Some people actually do believe that, even among Muslims. But we'll see, even today, how that is true. About the Umayyad Khilafah al-Amawiyya, there's some negativities about it. Many negativities about it, actually. And so, it is very much transgressed upon in history. The Khilafah al-Amawiyya is very much transgressed upon in history. And this is a message that are Orientalists. And Orientalists are those that have studied Islam from a Western perspective and have conveyed Islam to the West from that perspective with the main goal in history, the main goal to turn people off and away from Islam. That was the main goal of the Orientalists in the past. Perhaps not today, but in the past that was their main goal. And so their message, and the one that they love to propagate, is that Islam was spread by the sword by evil tyrant kings. We'll show how this is false. Definitely they did many mistakes. Definitely the Khilafah al-Amawiyya did many mistakes. For sure. But these mistakes, Dr. Raghib says, are diluted in the sea of good deeds that they have done. Diluted in a sea of good deeds. Khilafah al-Amawiyya was from 40 Hijri to 132 Hijri. That's 92 years. And history tells us that only the last 7 years were the ones that were corrupt. The last 7 years were full of corruption, unfortunately. It featured many caliphs, many khulafa that contributed immensely to Islam. Examples? Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan. He wasn't actually a caliph, but he contributed immensely to Islam. And we'll see how today, inshallah. Another one that's famous is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Yes, he was from the Umayyad Khilafah. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, known as the 5th righteous caliph. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was an Umayyad, and he filled the Khilafah with mercy and justice. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was perhaps known to not have deserved to be the Khalif. Many people believe that. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan should not have been the Khalif. Perhaps that's true. And the time of Muawiyah was a time of fitna, a time of tribulation, a time of hardship, of confusion. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz says a very interesting statement. He says that these are people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forsaked us from their blood. We did not live in their times. We did not live in the times where the Muslims were actually fighting each other. We didn't live in that time. So let's forsake them from our tongues. Let's be respectful of all of them. Both sides of the party, both sides of the line. He says this. The saying by Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And the true story of fitna is one that we should face head on. It's not something that we should avoid. Unfortunately, we sometimes avoid it. But that's not what we should do. We should actually face it head on. It's not the place for it here. But it's something I recommend everyone to do. The story of the fitna. What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? It's history. We shouldn't just ignore it. But we have to be very careful where we obtain the information from. Because this region, this time, is ripe for Orientalists to plant seeds of doubt. For anti-Islam thinkers to plant seeds of doubt. See what happened after the Prophet passed away? Fitna. These Muslims, they're not good for anything. That's what they say. The Khilafah al-Amawiyya. The last 7 years, they deviated. And it is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that when a ruling party is full of corruption and corruption spreads, others will rise and take the lead. And this is the Khilafah al-Abbasiyya, the Abbasid Caliphate, that rose after the Umayyad Caliphate. However, the opening of Al-Andalus and bringing it to Islam is a good deed on the scale of good deeds of the Umayyad dynasty. So this is a very interesting graph that shows us what the Prophet ﷺ spread, how he brought Islam. Can everyone see that? How and where he brought Islam, and what the Khilafah al-Rashidiyya, the Khulafa al-Rashidun did, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman and Ali, and what the Umayyad Khilafah did. And you can see there Morocco, and you can see right above it Spain, Al-Andalus. Chapter 1. Nusayr. Nusayr was a very interesting person. His name was actually Nasr, but the companions and the believers at the time, they called him Nusayr because he was a young lad. His name was Nasr, but they called him Nusayr because he was a young man. He was 14. He was actually a Christian student on his way to become a monk in Syria. And in the battle of Ain al-Tamr, led by Khalid ibn al-Walid, he was actually captured, and he was 14 when he was captured. He was captured by Khalid ibn al-Walid's army. And we can see here the value of da'wah and the value of introducing Islam. Nusayr was introduced to Islam, and he loved its teachings, and he adopted it, and he became Muslim. And if Islam was not introduced, perhaps he would have been and lived and died as a monk, and that would have been his only contribution. But his good deeds and the deeds of his son after him are all shared by Khalid ibn al-Walid. His son is Musa ibn Nusayr, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, inshallah. So Nusayr is a very interesting example of this verse. And who is better in speech? وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَى إِلَى اللَّهِ. Who is better in speech than one who invites to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and does righteousness and says, indeed, I am of the believers, of the Muslims. Nasr and his son Musa are the fruit of da'wah, the da'wah that we were just talking about, the spreading of the message of Islam, undertaken by Muslims. Musa ibn Nusayr, chapter 2, was his son. He was born in the year 19 Hijri. So he's young, and he grew up with the sons of the Khulafa, of the Caliphs. He was skilled in warfare. He became the commander of the navy at the time of Uthman ibn Affan. He became one of the commanders in the navy. And he took part in the opening of Cyprus. Sheikh Khalid mentioned Cyprus. Musa ibn Nusayr actually took part in the opening of Cyprus, and it was during the Khilafah of Muawiyah. Where is Cyprus? Let's take a look. Can anyone tell me where Cyprus is? Does anyone know where Cyprus is? Yes? It's right there. Jazakallah khairan. That is Cyprus. Musa ibn Nusayr, he actually witnessed the second fitna. And the second fitna happened during the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. During the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, when he was the Khalifa, there was a dispute over who should be the Khalifa. And so it was believed that Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, the son of the Sahabi, should have been the Khalifa. And Musa ibn Nusayr did something that many Muslims in Syria did. He actually voted and pledged allegiance to Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, not to Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And he was amongst them. Well, Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr actually lost, and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan remained the Khalifa. Again, it's a fitna. It was a time when the believers were divided. They didn't know who to elect as a leader. Musa ibn Nusayr fled to Egypt. And in Egypt, he actually met with the ruler of Egypt at the time, who was the brother of the Khalifa, Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan. Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan pardoned Musa, understanding that it was a fitna, and it ended. Alhamdulillah, the fitna ended, and we should pardon each other. We should understand that a fitna happened, that it was a dispute, and we should not hold it against each other. So he pardoned him. Does anyone know who Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan is? Who's his son? Show of hands. Yes. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Jazakallah khair. Musa served in Egypt until he became a minister in the ruling party of Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan. And Musa was given a grave assignment. He was given a very important assignment. This assignment would change the course of history. West Africa, to regain and return stability to it. It was very unstable. And Musa was given this assignment, to return stability to this region, to West Africa. This was in 86 Hijri, 705 Common Era. I like to write CE as opposed to AD. AD means after death. And so we Muslim believes that the Prophet Isa did not actually die. And so I like to use CE, Common Era, better. West Africa, chapter 3. Musa found a few reasons for the region's instability. He found certain reasons as in why the region was unstable, why the instability there. The Berbers. Nabil is actually a Berber. And the Berbers are very proud and free. They caused lots of problems for the Muslimin at the time. The zeal of Uqba ibn Nafi' is reported to have said this saying. He says, by Allah, O ocean, he's talking to the Atlantic Ocean when he reached it. He says, by Allah, if I knew that beyond you is a land to be opened for the sake of Allah, I would have passed you with this horse of mine. He's saying this to the Atlantic Ocean. We all know how vast the Atlantic Ocean is. And we all know the land that lies behind it. The zeal of Uqba was a mistake. Because he used to pass from one region to the next without giving enough time for the regions that have already been conquered, been open to Islam, to stabilize, to settle. Not enough time, not enough Muslim numbers to stabilize the region. So Musa saw this. Islam also did not settle. So the Berbers actually were not given the opportunity to become Muslim. And so, this was the fact of history. The Berber tribes used to see Muslims as invaders. They were not given the opportunity to become Muslim, and so they saw these Muslims as invaders. And the Berbers are actually a free nation. Unlike the Copts in Egypt, for example. So when Egypt was opened, the Copts were happy because they were actually enslaved by the Romans. But the Berbers were free. They definitely had idol worship and definitely needed Islam, but they didn't understand that. And so just like the Arabs, they were free, a free people. And it's very hard to not, communicate this message to them without putting effort. And Uqba ibn Nafi' unfortunately did not do that. And so, once given the chance, they would rebel and attack the ruling Muslims right away. Musa ibn Saif followed a different policy, a different strategy. He opened West Africa slowly, over 6 years. He reopened it actually. It was already open, but then it fell again, and then it opened, and then it fell again. So he reopened it over 6 years, as opposed to just a few months. And he allowed and wanted for Islam and for Muslims to settle politically and militarily first. But not only that, because that is not enough. That is not enough. He did something very interesting. He looked at the essence of this conquest. In the essence of it is spreading Islam. It's not about more land that you gain and say that I have more land. It's not about the map that we just showed. It's about spreading Islam. And so Musa ibn Saif looked at it that way. He said, let's spread Islam. Let's do just that. And he did. And so in 86 Hijri, he sent for scholars and du'at from the Tabi'een to spread Islam in the region. He, in agreement with Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, and this is a huge role that Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan played. They did just that, to teach people Islam and what it has to offer. They brought many scholars of Islam to West Africa. And in West Africa, you'll see many graves of the Tabi'een, because they went there not as army people, not as military people, they went there as du'at, to call to Islam, to invite people to Islam, to teach about Islam. And hence established the first learning center in Al-Qayrawan, one of the very first learning centers. Where is Al-Qayrawan? Does anyone know? No one knows? Yes, Tunisia. And the Berbers entered into Islam in thousands. Thousands. In the span of 6 years or so, in thousands. And they saw the beauty of this way of life, and the tolerance, and the generosity and righteousness that it brings forth, and the equality and justice. Because in their minds, Muslims were invaders, and Muslims hence were a higher people, and they were subjugated. They were a lesser form of people. This, to any free man, is unacceptable. Unacceptable. But when they understood that Islam is about equality, when it does not have up high and down low, when everyone is equal, regardless of race and color or gender, then they realized this. They accepted Islam in the thousands. So this is where Al-Qayrawan is. Right there. And Al-Qayrawan has a very beautiful mosque called the Mosque of Uqba ibn Nafi. This is the fence around the old city. One of the first cities established by Muslims in West Africa. We're still in West Africa. So something that Musa ibn Nusayr did is that he brought the local people into the fold of Islam. He established learning centers with the help of Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, who sent envoys from the Tabi'een that came and lived in West Africa to teach Islam. And as a result, Islam stayed in this region, despite the 130 years of colonization by the French. Despite that, Islam is deeply rooted in Algeria, for example. Deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Tariq ibn Zayd was another fruit of this effort. He was among those that reverted to Islam. He was a Berber. Tariq ibn Zayd is our next chapter. Musa appointed Tariq ibn Ziyad as a commander. He rose in the ranks of the military and became a commander. And this proves that, and this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated in Musnad Ahmed, that it doesn't matter what color you are, doesn't matter if you're an Arab or a non-Arab, doesn't matter if you're black or red or black. What matters is your taqwa. This is the distinguishing factor that Islam brought forth. The element that ensures that everyone has the opportunity to grow this in their hearts and become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a Berber was appointed to be a commander. He doesn't have to be an Arab to be a commander. And Islam is a message to all of mankind, regardless of race. This was proof of this. He was also suitable to command the army because it had Berbers. And he had this unique skill of being able to speak both Arabic and Berber, like Nabi. Tariq ibn Ziyad was born in 50 Hijri in Algiers. He reverted to Islam in his youth at the hands of Musa ibn Nusayr. And he became one of the top commanders. And he led the Muslim army, opening all of West Africa. And he was appointed over Tangier. So he was the wali of Tangier for some time. We'll show you where Tangier is in a bit. And he led the Muslim army into Al-Andalus in Sha'ban of 92 Hijri. This is where Tangier is. Right there. The sea, chapter 5. One of the reasons of the region's instability was the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was actually crumbling and losing focus and losing power. But it still had certain power over the sea. And so Musa ibn Nusayr, remember we talked about Musa having something unique about him? He has this experience in the Navy. And now he's in West Africa and he realizes that for West Africa to remain stable, he has to have some power over the sea. And so he establishes a powerful Navy fleet. This fleet brought Islam to the many islands in the Mediterranean, islands that we hear about today that are unfortunately and sadly not part of the Muslim Ummah anymore, such as Sardinia, such as Sicily, such as the Balearic Islands. Where are these islands? We'll show you in the next slide. This was around 89 Hijri, 708 Common Era. Where are these islands? Let's see. There they are. Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily. These were brought into the fold of Islam during the time of Musa ibn Nusayr. The sea. Septim was a city that remained a problem. Very interesting city. And it's very interesting that we highlight this verse right here, that and you throw not when you threw, but it was Allah who threw. Meaning that when you do your best efforts, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that grants you the success, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that grants you the skills to put in this best effort. And so it's not you that did this, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We attribute this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to yourself. And so, very interesting, Septim was a city, and we'll show you that city in the next few slides, was ruled by a man called Julian. Julian ruled Septim, and he was a very strategic person. And he had foresight. He understood that West Africa was now ruled quickly, over a span of 6 years, not how it used to be ruled in the past. It's not just conquest and then people rebel and so he's in a safe zone. No, he's now surrounded by Muslims, and so he understands that he's not going to stay there. And Septim was a very much stronghold that was preventing Muslims from entering there. It's a seaport, and so the Muslims wanted it, but they couldn't really reach it. Julian understood that it's only a matter of time before he loses it, and so ever the strategist, he made an offer to Musa ibn Nusayr. This is the offer. He said, you'll take the port, I'll leave the whole city, you can take it. He doesn't care. Take it. You can take the ships that are in the port. You can use them for your navy fleet. And he says, I'll give you information about Al-Andalus as well. I'll give you information about Al-Andalus. In return, he wanted some riches. He said that he wanted land in Al-Andalus. He said, just give me land that's in Al-Andalus, and I'll give you the rest. And so, was this offer accepted by Musa ibn Nusayr? Yes. Rabih al-Bay', as the Prophet ﷺ has reported to have said once. Profitable is the sale. Some land, some riches, doesn't matter. Right? That's not the purpose of what we're doing. The purpose is to spread Islam. So if some land will be given to a non-Muslim, and that will enable us to regain this land and this whole region and put it under the fold of Islam, so be it. It proves that Muslims did not aim to own the lands. They didn't care about the land. That was not the purpose. They had a clarity of purpose. They understood what this was all about. Here it is. Septim. So remember Tangier? Septim is right there. Much closer to Al-Andalus. A seaport. And it's from this place actually that Tariq ibn Ziyad took off to Al-Andalus, inshallah, after a few slides, in a few years that is. Al-Andalus is chapter 6, and this is a bit of a longer chapter before we conclude, inshallah, today. Al-Andalus was a dream. It was a dream that was felt by Uthman ibn Affan. Remember I said Constantinople? How does it relate to Al-Andalus? This was a saying by Uthman ibn Affan. Uthman ibn Affan actually attempted to enter Constantinople, Constantinople, but he couldn't. The army there was much more powerful. The Roman Empire was still strong. Who opens Constantinople later on, many years later? Does anyone know? Yes. Muhammad al-Fatih, Jazakumullah khair. Many years later, Muhammad al-Fatih does this. He opens Constantinople. So Uthman ibn Affan says that the only way to open it is through sea. And if you open Al-Andalus, you will be partners with whoever opens Constantinople in Ajj. Be partners in Ajj for opening Constantinople. This is something that Uthman ibn Affan said. It was an old dream. It was not new to Musa ibn Nusayr to dream of it. But Musa ibn Nusayr started to plan for Al-Andalus. And so, let's talk a bit about the geography of Al-Andalus. The geography of Al-Andalus is very interesting because later on in the series, the events will be happening in Al-Andalus. And so to understand the region, it's good to touch upon it briefly right now. Imagine it as a rectangle, one with the corner at the bottom pointing towards Al-Maghrib, towards Morocco. 5 main rivers that flow into both the Atlantic Ocean from the west and into the Mediterranean Sea in the south. Some of them are, the longest being, and that's the Spanish name for it. Perhaps you'd read it Guadalquivir, but it's actually from Wad al-Kabir, or Wad al-Kabir, Wadi al-Kabir, the big or the great valley. Another river is called Al-Manzura or Al-Mansura, the place of victory. Another is Guadalit or Wadi al-Layth or al-Leith. And al-Leith is actually a Greek word which means forgetfulness, and so it's called the valley of forgetfulness. This is another river that flows in Al-Andalus. Let's see that in pictures. This is Al-Andalus. This is how it was divided. And this is a picture that shows us the rivers, many rivers flowing. Geography continuing. Many mountains, one called the Pyrenees, northeast of Al-Andalus, bordering with France, has a peak 3.4 kilometers high. And there's also the Strait of Gibraltar. It's a narrow strait that connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. That strait is wide, 13 kilometers at some points, 37 kilometers other points. Gibraltar actually comes from Jabal Tariq, the name of a mountain, which we'll also show you in a bit, inshallah. Jabal Tariq is the mountain where Tariq ibn Ziyad and his army landed in Al-Andalus. Important cities in Al-Andalus: Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada. Also another one is Septem, that we just touched upon briefly. Let's look at this picture. This is actually a satellite image of the Pyrenees. And it shows how elevated that land is. On one side, in the bottom, you have Spain, or Al-Andalus, and in the north you have France. This is another image of the Pyrenees mountain. This is a satellite image of how it looks like from space. Another image, a 3D image, that shows Al-Maghrib and Al-Andalus. One more time. Now, can everyone actually see this image? This is actually on the shores of Al-Maghrib. So you're on the Al-Maghrib shore right here, and you're looking at Al-Andalus. This is what the Muslims would see. They would stand there, and this is what they would see. Does everyone see a mountain there? Yes? That's Jabal Tariq. That is Jabal Tariq. Here it is. Another picture of Jabal Tariq. You probably heard about this mountain a lot. There it is. People of Al-Andalus before the conquest. Now it's very important that we understand the situation of the people of Al-Andalus. This will answer the question as in why Al-Andalus was open at that time, what brought Islam, why the need for Islam during that time. The people of Al-Andalus before the conquest and before Islam entered Al-Andalus. How were they like? Were they rich, aristocratic, happy? They didn't need Islam. If they were happy, why Islam? If they were unhappy, what did Islam bring forth? They were actually tribes called the Vandal tribes. And some say that Vandal is actually the root word for vandalism. And so these were very barbaric tribes. Very barbaric tribes. And some say that the name Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, comes from this, from vandalism, from Vandalusia, which became Andalusia. And then when the Muslims came, it became Al-Andalus. Hence the name. The Visigoths. These were the tribes that lived for a much longer time in Al-Andalus. They're a Germanic tribe from southern Sweden. They adhered to what is known as Arianism. Arianism is a form of Christianity, but a different form, one that we don't hear about today. We'll talk about briefly what that is. So Arians believed that God and the Son, meaning Jesus, ﷺ, were different, and that the Son, though he may be the most perfect of creations, was only a creation of God. This is very close to what we believe. Very close to what we believe. That Isa ﷺ was not the Son, he wasn't God himself, was not the same as God. He was actually a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they believed in this. And in 325 Common Era, something happened. The first Council of Nicaea. We all have fiqh councils, right? Alhamdulillah, we have fiqh councils. These councils, scholars of Islam meet, discuss different issues, and come out with a set of recommendations or a set of fatwas, right? Some people don't like that, but it's very common. It's much better than what happens in Christianity. In Islam, we deal with minor issues, issues that face the common person, issues that are not so clear to every Muslim, not issues of aqeedah, not issues of belief, right? But the Council of Nicaea was a council that was made in 325, was held by the scholars of Christianity at the time, talking about the roots and the ethics and the main essence of belief in Christianity. They were pushing and promoting the Trinity. They were pushing and promoting that God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost, whatever that is, are one. That they're one. This was the Council of Nicaea. This is what it was promoting and pushing for. It was actually one of the reasons the Council of Nicaea was held to combat Arianism. Because Arianism was spreading. People found it logical. How can a human being be God? It makes sense. So people were actually converting to Arianism, and the Christians at the time, the ruling party in Rome at the time, Constantinople himself, did not like that. And so they held the first Council of Nicaea in 325 to combat that. And they called Arianism a heretic belief, a bid'ah. Another council was held by Constantinople because he felt it was not enough. He felt it's not just enough to call them heretic. In fact, we need to re-emphasize the importance of the Trinity. And there was this confusion, is the Holy Ghost also God, or is it just Jesus that's God? And so they wanted to clarify that and said, you know what, also the Holy Ghost, He's also God. That was what the Council of Constantinople did. Until recently, there was even the First Vatican Council in 1868, and it also dealt with certain issues. One of the issues that this council, this final last one here, dealt with was papal infallibility. That the Pope was infallible. That he cannot make any mistake. He is the representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and hence he is infallible. This is something that this council came up with. There are many councils over the history of Christianity that talk about different issues. And some correct things and some re-clarify things until what we have today. Al-Andalus, this is actually, show you this map again, is the map of the Visigoth, how they reached Al-Andalus. They were Arians, right? They believed in Arianism, and hence they were actually pushed by the Roman Empire at the time. They came from way over there, traveled all the way south there, and then went up there again, and went down there. In 410, they did something very interesting. They actually sacked Rome. So Rome was attacked by the Visigoth in 410. But then they were kicked out, and they were moved all the way to Al-Andalus. It is said that Al-Andalus was ruled by the Vandal, and the Vandal didn't even believe in God. And so the Roman Empire said, you know what, it's better to have the Visigoths there, at least they're Christian, than have the Vandal. And they didn't have a far-reaching power, so they said, you know what, Visigoths, go to Andalusia, rid it of the Vandals, and become the rulers over there. And that's what they did. And they moved and lived there for many years since 418. Arians were tolerant of other religions and of Jews. They were very tolerant. It's very interestingly, that's what history records. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only knows the truth, but that's what they say. In 589, something dramatic happened to the Visigoths. Under Ricard I, he converted to Catholicism. He converted to Catholicism, and he became a Catholic. He believed in the Nicene faith. And so, Catholic bishops immediately instituted the program of forced conversions to Catholicism. He found bishops coming there, yes.
I have to go because
طيب.
I have to discuss in the mosque.
جزاك الله خير. جزاك الله خير.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and make secure.
آمين. جزاك الله خير. So why are we talking about the history and the religion of the people? It's very important to know what the state of the people was before Islam entered. How was it? What did they do? What did they believe in? Catholic bishops immediately instituted programs to convert people by force to Catholicism. No one was allowed to be an Arian anymore. No one was allowed to be a Jew anymore. No one was allowed to be anything else except a Catholic. By force. And Arianism was deemed a heresy. In 633, at the Fourth Council of Toledo, another council was held in Toledo. The Catholic bishops took the right to select the king. And so before that, nobles were selecting the king of the Visigoths. But then, at that point in time, Catholic bishops got that power. Secularism, dear brothers and sisters, is a response to this. Because there's so much injustice in this, right? The Catholic Church did so much injustice in Europe that secularism hated the Catholic Church. Secularism is a movement that is anti-religious, we all know that. But in reality, it's not anti-all religions, it's actually anti-church, because of what the church did, and it's very understandable. in 633 Common Era, the same Catholic bishops declared that all Jews must be baptized. Al-Andalus is only a part of Europe. How was the situation in Europe? This is known as the Dark Ages, and it continued until the 16th century. Remember, the opening of Andalus happened in year 711. So 600 years later, 600? No, more than that. 900 years later, that's when Dark Ages stopped happening in Europe. It was grave ignorance, all kinds of injustice, all kinds of transgression. Rulers lived in luxury while the people lived in immense poverty, and they were transgressed against. Taxes was not a system, it was just a way for the rulers to get money from the poor. Who saw Robin Hood or knows about Robin Hood? And you see how taxes was collected from the poor, and how Robin Hood came and saved the people? Because that's how it was during the Dark Ages. The rulers would collect taxes from the poor with undue rights and accumulate it and become wealthier and wealthier and better. That was the main form of injustice, but there were many others. There was no cleanliness, no showering. It was that the rulers kept the people in dirt, poverty and ignorance, far from civilization. The rulers were clean. They used to shower. When you watch old movies and you see, the king and the queen, they're very well groomed and well dressed. But the common folk, the people, they were rid from this. They were ingrained to believe that showering is something bad. Imagine someone that showers and says, "Astaghfirullah, I can't shower." That's horrible. But that's how it was in Europe, and it was widespread. It was rampant. And hence, you hear about so many diseases and so many epidemics that were happening in Europe at the time. Right? Why didn't these epidemics happen in the Muslim world? They were living in the same era. Because Muslims used to shower, alhamdulillah. Immorality was rampant. Rituals of burning the deceased and burning the wife of the deceased, for example, was common. In fact, Spanish historians, when they talk about the fall of Al-Andalus, they say that the reason it fell was because it was filled with decadence. Decadence was a word used by Baber in the series Little Mosque on the Prairies. He says decadence, Western decadence. That's what he says. And decadence really is the decay of morality. And that's how Andalusia was. And Andalus was filled with decadence. And that's how the Spanish, that's what they attribute to the fall of Andalusia, but that's not true. That's not the only reason. Al-Andalus, Musa sought permission from the Khalifa, Al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik. Al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik became the Khalifa, and Musa sought his permission to open Al-Andalus. And so, he says, "Can I open it? I got this offer from Julian that has information, ships, a port, and I'll just give him some land and open Al-Andalus." Al-Walid said, "Send an infantry so as to see it and test it out. We're not used to battles at sea. We're not used to it. It was still something new. The navy was still in its infancy." And Musa said, "It's not a sea of greatness. It's just, 13 kilometers that we pass, and that's it. It's not really a sea battle. It's a land battle." But Al-Walid insisted and said, "Even so, it must be tested with an infantry first." And Musa obeyed. And so, in Ramadan of 91 Hijri, 710 Common Era, a man, a Berber, named Tarif ibn Malik, leads a surveying company of troops of 400 mujahideen on 4 ships from Septim to Al-Andalus. It is said that he takes off from Septim with intelligence from Julian. Some say that Julian actually went with them as their guide, but that's not confirmed. Tarif ibn Malik was the first Muslim to set foot in Al-Andalus. So if I ask this question at the end, who was the first Muslim to set foot in Al-Andalus? Or if Brother Sharif, Fawad, next session, asks this question, this is the answer, inshallah. Tarif reported back. He reported back to Musa ibn Nusayr. What did he report back? Well, this is actually where Tarif landed. This is where Tarif landed. In a city that is known today as Tarif, in Andalusia, in Spain. Tarif, from Tarif. His name is Tarif, and the city is after his name. Al-Andalus, this is what Tarif reported, and this is what they used to hear, the situation of the kings in Al-Andalus. In 694, a king known as Ergeka enacted the most severe anti-human laws, confiscated all Jewish land, all Jews to be enslaved by Christians, and all Jewish children to be kidnapped and raised as Christians, and trial by ordeal. Actually, before we go into that, why is it all Jews, 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 Jews? Are there non-Jews over there? Definitely were. But see, Jews are very keen on documenting their history. And so the books of history that report on this era, most of them say, all of them say Jews. Very rarely do you find anything that says anything about non-Jews. Because unfortunately, non-Jews don't have proponents today to say we had non-Jews that were perished in these laws as well. They had something called the trial by ordeal, a horrible way of torture. And actually, through this series, you'll see how the Christians used to, form and have different forms of torture and force people to convert to Catholicism. In the trailer that we saw, did anyone actually see the cross that had a black sheet over it? Did anyone see it? No? No? All right. So it's a common practice that during a session of torture, they would have a cross, but they would cover it with a black sheet, because they're doing something that they understand is horrible, and they wanted to hide from the cross. So it's very common practice during the Inquisitions, when Al-Andalus sadly fell, the Inquisitions happened. A very common practice. The cross would be there, covered by the black sheet. The trial by ordeal is one of those ways. By fire, by boiling water, cold water, oil, lead, ingestion, etc. And what does that mean? It's actually a common way used by the law in the country, a very barbaric way of enforcing law. How is that? It's not that the guilty gets punished, it's that you prove your guilt or your innocence through this process. For example, in a pot of boiling water, there's a piece of stone there that you have to put your hands in the boiling water and get that piece with. If you're burnt, you're guilty. If you're not burnt, you're innocent. Isn't that insane? Isn't that insane? They used to wrap the person's hands for 3 days after that incident, and after 3 days they would check. They would have a medical person or a priest check it out. And if it was healing, they would say, God is healing you, and hence you're innocent. And some of these were actually causing death. They would cause death. And the Christians and the people at the time believed that if you die because of a trial by ordeal, you go to paradise if you're innocent. So in other words, you're leaving this world for a better place, so we're actually helping you go to Jannah. It was reduced after one of the councils. Remember the councils we talked about? One of the councils said that we'll discontinue it. But this happened only in the 16th century. So imagine, for 900 years after the opening of Al-Andalus, Europe remained and continued to do this horrible practice. In 703 CE, Common Era, Watiza inherited the throne. He was the son of Ergeka. He tried to make things right. So he found himself owning so much land that was confiscated by his father, and he felt, this is unjust, I want to return this land to the owners. So he started to do that, slowly, gradually, wanted to be a bit righteous, a bit just in his ruling. Unfortunately, the ruling elite did not like that. And so in 710, political coup happened, led by Roderick. Roderick is the king of the Visigoths that Tariq ibn Ziyad kills when he arrives in Al-Andalus. Roderick had the support of the nobles because they felt that their lands was going to be given to the poor again. And so they didn't want this, so they supported Roderick for this coup. And this divided Al-Andalus. Roderick controlled the southwest. Achila, who's the son of Watiza, ruled northeast of Andalus. And Julian ruled Septim. So if you had that question, why did Septim make that offer? We'll find out now. So what happened, here's the beautiful map that shows what happened and how it was divided. And you see that green crossed out area in the center? That's what Tariq ibn Ziyad entered and ruled that area, and gradually grew to encompass all of Spain, all of Al-Andalus. Julian of Septim. He gave refuge to the relatives of Watiza and the Aryans and the Jews. And he took sides with Musa ibn Nusayr against Roderick. So one of the reasons he made this offer is because he wanted to rid Roderick from power. And the land, there's so much land that Watiza had, it's actually the land of the people, he wanted to take for himself. So he promised to give Septim to Musa, a port which he can launch his attacks from. He promised to give him ships, to give him support, not just military intelligence, but also the support of the people. Julian had connections with the Aryans that were living in Al-Andalus, and he promised Musa, the support of the people. And Musa asked him, what do you want in return? He said, I just wanted the land, 1,000 large farms spread all over Al-Andalus that was owned by Watiza. And Musa saw it as a bargain, a cheap price that he'll be paying for the freedom of this kingdom from tyranny. But he was unsure of Julian, and also he was obeying the Caliph's, the Khalifa's orders, and so he sent Tarif ibn Malik on this surveying reconnaissance mission to Al-Andalus. It was July of 710 Common Era. It was Ramadan of 91 Hijri. They were fasting. And Tarif ibn Malik, a Berber, was leading an army of 400 men surveying the area. And they went as deep as 18 miles in. And they looked all over the terrain and studied it. They traveled 18 miles and they met with Christians that were very hospitable and supportive of the Muslims. And Tarif returned announcing that Andalus is ripe for liberation. So, dear brothers and sisters, in 92 Hijri, 711 Common Era, an army of 7,000 Muslims was prepared. Many were Muslim Berbers. They were led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, and they landed on the shores of Al-Andalus. They are known as the Procession of Light in history books. And so Tariq Soidan says this very interesting quote about the Procession of Light. He says, وطلع موكب النور ولا يحتاج النور إلى قوة قاهرة ولا جيوش جرارة ولا أعتدة مدمرة ولا إلى ذهب يلمع وإنما يحتاج إلى نوعية فرد يحب الموت لإعلاء كلمة الله بل يرى إن الحياة تبدأ عندما يسقط أحدهم شهيدا فيقول فزت ورب الكعبة. This is the type of people that were in this army. They were a procession of light. They didn't want gold. They didn't need it. They didn't need destroying equipment or a never-ending army. They didn't need it. They just had to have this quality of loving death for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Loving death for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For the sake of rising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words in the Quran and justice in the land and spreading it. And in fact, they see that life begins when they die for this sake. And they say, I won by the Lord of Al-Kaaba. Does anyone know who's the actual original author or sayer of this quote? Fuztu wa Rabbil Kaaba. No? He's a very interesting Sahabi that very little is known about. You know how as a Sahaba we know very much about them, right? This Sahabi we know very little about. He attended Badr, he attended Uhud, and apparently he was very keen on dying for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that when it happened, this is what he said. It is said that a spear entered his back and appeared in front of him in his chest, and he saw it. And when he did, he didn't go, ouch. He didn't go, oh my God, I'm going to die. He didn't say any of that. The thing that he said was, Fustu wa Rabbil Kaaba. I have won by the Lord of the Kaaba. It is said that the man that did this to him was so shocked by this that he went and asked about Islam. And when it was introduced to him, he became Muslim. His name is Haram ibn Milhan. I don't have his name here actually. So that's a question, that's a trivia question that's not in the slides. The Prophet ﷺ has said this beautiful hadith which Sheikh Khalid has shared with us. The hadith is a conversation between him and the Sahaba. The Prophet said, soon nations will call one another against you, just as people call one another to eat from a platter of food. The Sahaba said, will this be because we'll be very few in number when this happens, O Messenger of Allah? He said, no. No, you'll be many. You will be the froth, or you'll be froth, like the froth of a torrent. And froth is the bubbles. And when you have a stream of water coming because of rain, there's some bubbles that get formed. That's froth. It's not connected to each other. It blows up easily. It's very soft, it's insignificant. And that's the analogy the Prophet ﷺ is giving. He also says that Allah will remove from the hearts of your enemy any veneration of you. It's not just fear, but veneration. And veneration is, when you look in the dictionary, it actually means respect. It means awe. It means that you consider that person as an equal. And this is a prediction of the Prophet ﷺ. The veneration will be lost. And Allah will throw in your hearts something known as wahan. Sahaba asked, what is wahan? And he said, the love of this dunya and hating death. This was not the attributes of the people of Al-Andalus that freed Al-Andalus, that liberated it. That is the attitude of people today, unfortunately. Procession of light. Tariq ibn Ziyad passed the Straits of Gibraltar, or Madiq Tariq, known by his name. He took off from Septim. They met in the valley of a large rock mountain, which came to be known as Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Dr. Tariq Soledad says, this is the final quote for this evening, he says, this is a small worldly gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the mountain and the strait to be known by the name of Tariq ibn Ziyad till this day. And then he quotes this verse and he says that if anyone desires a reward in this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the reward both in this life and the hereafter. Next time, inshallah Rabbil Alameen, some questions will be answered. How will Tariq ibn Ziyad face Roderick's army? Will Islam be received in Andalus? How? How will the rule of law, justice and order be returned to these lands? What will become of Tariq ibn Ziyad? What will become of Musa ibn Nusayr? These are some questions, inshallah, that we'll be addressing next time, inshallah Rabbil Alameen. With that, I conclude this session. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه. Anything good I may have said is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Anything bad or mistaken or harmful is from me. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me, and I ask you to forgive me, inshallah Rabbil Alameen. Jazakumullah khair.